Most gardeners spend April planting vegetables, then spend the next 11 months replanting those same vegetables over and over again, like some kind of agricultural hamster wheel. But there's a category of crops that changes everything: perennial vegetables. Plant them once and they produce food for 5, 10, sometimes 30 years without replanting, without starting seeds indoors, without any of the annual chaos that makes gardening feel like a full-time job. The problem isn't that these plants are hard to grow. It's that nobody talks about them because the seed companies cut and profit from something you only buy once. Here is how to plant a vegetable garden that produces food forever using the 20 perennial crops that grow like fruit trees. The fundamental shift that needs to happen in your mind is this. Stop thinking of your garden as an annual project and start thinking of it as a permanent food forest where you install crops once and harvest for decades. Because that's exactly what perennial vegetables are. They're the infrastructure of a self-sufficient garden. And once you understand which ones actually work and how to establish them properly, you'll never go back to the insanity of replanting tomatoes every single spring. Let's start with the obvious one that almost nobody grows. Asparagus. This is the gateway perennial because everyone has heard of it, but almost nobody plants it because it takes 2 years before you can harvest. And that wait scares people off, but here's what they don't tell you. Once that asparagus bed is established, it produces heavily for 20 to 30 years. You plant it once in deep, rich soil with plenty of compost worked in. You wait through the first year while the crowns establish roots. You wait through the second year while they build strength. And then in year 3, you start cutting spears every single spring for the next 3 decades. That's 28 years of asparagus from 2 years of patience. A 10-feet row of asparagus will produce 10 to 15 pounds of spears every spring once it is mature. That adds $50 to $75 worth of vegetables every year for 30 years from a one-time investment of maybe $30 in crowns. Rhubarb is even more impressive because it's nearly indestructible and produces for 50 years or more. You plant one rhubarb crown in spring in soil that's been heavily composted. And by the second year, you're harvesting stalks. By the third year, that single plant is producing enough rhubarb for pies, jams, and fresh eating all season long. And it just keeps going. Rhubarb survives hard freezes, tolerates poor soil better than most crops, and actually prefers cold winters. One plant occupies maybe for square ft and produces 10 to 20 pounds of stalks every year for half a century. Rhubarb is even more impressive because it's nearly indestructible and produces for 50 years or more. You plant one rhubarb crown in spring in soil that's been heavily composted. And by the second year, you're harvesting stalks. By the third year, that single plant is producing enough rhubarb for pies, jams, and fresh eating all season long. And it just keeps going. Rhubarb survives hard freezes, tolerates poor soil better than most crops, and actually prefers cold winters. One plant occupies maybe for square ft and produces 10 to 20 pounds of stalks every year for half a century. Now here's where it gets interesting. Walking onions are the strangest and most useful perennial alliums you can grow. They're called walking onions because they produce little bulbils at the top of their stalks. And when those stalks bend over under the weight, the bulbils touch the ground and root themselves, so the plant literally walks across your garden year after year. You can harvest the underground bulbs, which taste like strong onions. You can harvest the green tops like scallions all season long. And you can harvest the bulbils themselves and pickle them or plant them to start new colonies. One small patch of walking onions planted in spring will spread into a permanent onion bed that produces fresh alliums 12 months a year because they are cold hardy and grow even under snow. Egyptian walking onions are similar but even more productive. And multiplier onions, which are also called potato onions, work on the same principle. You plant one bulb in fall and by the next summer it is divided into 6 to 8 new bulbs underground. You harvest most of them and replant a few to continue the cycle. So the bed just perpetuates itself forever without buying new sets every year. Perennial kale is something most gardeners have never heard of, but it changes everything about growing brassicas. Regular kale is biennial. It grows leaves the first year, flowers the second year, and dies. But perennial kale varieties like Daubington's kale just keep growing year after year. They're woody at the base like a shrub, and you harvest by cutting side shoots, which encourages more growth. One plant can produce for 5 to 10 years. And since you can take cuttings and root them in water, you can expand your perennial kale patch indefinitely without ever buying seeds. Turkish rocket is another perennial brassica that almost nobody knows about. It tastes like arugula but milder, and it grows in dense clumps that you harvest by cutting leaves while the plant keeps producing new ones from the center. It's cold-hardy, shade-tolerant, and produces fresh greens from early spring through late fall. One clump expands over the years as the plant self-seeds. See, kale is the elite perennial brassica that deserves to be far more popular than it is. It produces thick, fleshy shoots in early spring that you blanch under a pot and harvest when they re-white and tender like asparagus. Then later in the season, you can harvest the leaves like kale. And the plant produces for 10 to 15 years once established. See, kale tolerates poor soil, doesn't need much water, and survives hard winters. Welsh onions are a bunching type that forms clumps of hollow green stalks you harvest like scallions year-round. They never form a bulb, they just keep producing grains. And in winter, they die back to the ground but come back strong every spring. Chives are another perennial allium everyone knows, but most people treat as decorative when it should be treated as a vegetable. A large clump of chives produces massive amounts of greens that you can harvest continuously from early spring through fall. And the clumps divide naturally, so you can split them every few years and expand your patch. Good King Henry is an ancient perennial green that was a staple vegetable in medieval Europe before spinach was introduced. It grows into tall clumps that you harvest by cutting the young shoots in spring like asparagus and the leaves in summer like spinach. It tolerates shade better than most vegetables and is extremely cold-hardy. One planting produces for 10 to 15 years. Lovage is technically an herb, but functions as a perennial celery substitute. The leaves taste like extremely strong celery, and you use them in soups, stews, and stocks. Lovage grows into a massive plant, 5 to 6 feet tall, that produces for 10 to 20 years. You harvest by cutting stalks and leaves throughout the season. And the plant gets bigger every year. Jerusalem artichokes, also called sunchokes, are perennial tubers that grow like potatoes but produce year after year without replanting. You plant a few tubers in spring and by fall the plants are 8 to 10 feet tall, with massive underground crops of knobbly tubers that taste sweet and nutty. You harvest some in fall and leave the rest in the ground, where they overwinter perfectly and sprout again in spring. The challenge is that they spread aggressively, so you need to contain them. But once established, they produce massive amounts of food with zero maintenance. Groundnut is a native North American perennial tuber that was a staple food for indigenous people. The tubers grow on rhizomes and taste like a cross between potatoes and nuts with high protein content. You plant a few tubers in spring, and by the second or third year, the patch is producing heavily. Groundnuts climb like beans, so you grow them on a trellis. And they produce both tubers underground and edible bean pods above ground. 9-star broccoli is a true perennial that produces small broccoli heads every spring for 5 to 10 years. You plant one seedling and in the second year, it starts producing. The heads are smaller than annual broccoli, maybe 3 to 4 inches across. But you get multiple heads per plant over a long season. And the plant overwinters and produces again the next year. Tree onions are another perennial allium where you harvest the green stalks like scallions, the small underground bulbs like shallots, and the bulbils at the top which you can pickle or replant. One small patch expands naturally and provides fresh alliums year-round. Wild leeks, also called ramps, are native North American perennials that grow in woodland conditions. Produce broad leaves in early spring, and you harvest the leaves like spinach or dig the small bulbs, which taste like a cross between garlic and onions. Ramps take several years to establish, but once you have a patch, it produces every spring indefinitely. Ostrich fern is a perennial that produces fiddleheads every spring. Fiddleheads are the young, coiled fronds that you harvest and cook like asparagus. Ostrich ferns grow in wet, shaded areas where most vegetables won't grow. One fern clump expands over the years, and you harvest fiddleheads in early spring before they unfurl. Daylilies are ornamental perennials that most people don't realize are entirely edible. The young shoots in spring taste like asparagus. The flower buds taste like green beans. The flowers themselves are sweet and crunchy, and the tubers underground are starchy and edible. So daylilies give you for different harvests throughout the season from one plant. Here's what this means in practice. Instead of spending March and April planting 50 different things, and then spending the next 8 months maintaining them and replanting succession crops, you spend one spring installing 20 perennial crops. And then for the next 10 to 30 years, you just harvest. You're not starting seeds. You're not transplanting. You're not replanting. You're just walking through your garden cutting asparagus in April, harvesting rhubarb in May, cutting walking onions, and perennial kale in June, harvesting sorrel and lovage in July, digging Jerusalem artichokes in August. And in winter, you're still harvesting multiplier onions and Welsh onions because they're cold hardy. The transformation from an annual garden to a perennial garden doesn't happen overnight. You gradually add perennial crops to unused corners, to edges of beds, to spaces that are awkward for annuals. And over 3 to 5 years, those perennial crops expand and start producing heavily. And you realize you're buying less at the store because the perennial patch is providing steady harvests without any of the work that annual crops require. The economics are staggering. A single asparagus crown costs $3 and produces $50 worth of spears every year for 30 years. That's $1,500 from a $3 investment. A rhubarb crown costs $10 and produces $30 worth of stalks every year for 50 years. A patch of walking onions costs $15 to start and produces $100 worth of onions and greens every year indefinitely. Compare that to annual vegetables where you spend $5 on tomato seeds, spend hours starting them indoors, transplanting them, staking them, and dealing with pests. And you get maybe $50 worth of tomatoes. Then next year you do it all over again. The work never stops, the cost never stops. Perennial vegetables break that cycle. You do the work once, you pay once, and then the system runs itself. The plants come back every year. They expand naturally. You plant them in permanent locations where they can stay for decades. You give them the best soil you have, you space them properly so they have room to expand. And you choose varieties that match your climate. Soil preparation is critical because you can't go back and improve it once the plants are established. So before you plant any perennial crop, you work massive amounts of compost into the soil. You make it deep and rich and loose, and then the perennial roots can penetrate deeply and access nutrients for decades. Start today by choosing 3 perennial vegetables that you actually eat regularly. Pick asparagus if you eat asparagus, pick rhubarb if you bake. Pick walking onions if you use scallions constantly. Plant them in spring in the best soil you have. And wait, the first year, they're establishing. The second year, they're growing. By the third year, they're producing. And by the 5th year, you'll wonder why you ever bothered with annual crops. These 20 vegetables grow like fruit trees. You plant them once, you wait for establishment. And then they produce food for decades without replanting, without starting seeds, without any of the annual chaos. The seed companies don't want you to know this because they cut and profit from crops you only buy once, but now you know.